In the latter part of high school, I think it was my senior year of high school, the movie Gladiator came out, and it is an epic film um, that has a lot. It's intense, but it really captivated me in that portion of life. Um, but it has this line in it that really kind of struck me to the core when I heard it. And it's repeated throughout the movie, but it says, in this life, what we do echoes for eternity, or what we do in this life echoes for eternity. And there's something in it that I think should resonate with all of us. I think we intuitively know that this is the truth. Um, and this is what we talked about last week a little bit at the end of our section, Revelation 14. If you guys remember, we've been talking about heaven and hell, and at the end of 14, uh, verse 12, John says this calls for patient endurance, this picture of heaven and hell on the part of the people of God who keep his commands and remain faithful to Jesus. And it says, Then I heard a voice from heaven say, Write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them. And again, so what we've been talking about is this reality of heaven and hell, both being in the presence of the Lamb, and yet there being one who rejects the love of the Lamb, rejects the blood that was slain, or the blood poured out for them. And then those that accept it and receive it. And this is fundamental to life. And so I also mentioned a few weeks ago this moment in college where my good friend Nick um, had me record myself on his cell phone as his ringtone. It's either heaven or hell, man. It's either heaven or hell. And kind of as a joke. But then I called him during class one day, not knowing that he was in class, and it went off. And so all the students and teachers hear me yelling out, "It's either heaven or hell, man! It's either heaven or hell." And I think that what we do need is we need. This is kind of my argument is John is trying to put things in black and white terms for the churches that he's writing to. Because the stakes are high about where their allegiance is, where their love is at, where their worship is. And and so this picture of heaven and hell is an important one for us to wrestle with. In this next portion of Revelation 14, we're going to see a judgment, and it's seen as a harvest. Um, so we see the first portion. He sees there before me was a white cloud. This is verse 14. And seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man, which brings to mind Revelation 1, um, and Jesus with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And then another angel came out of the temple and said, Now is the time. Take your sickle and reap, because the time has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So there's not a explicit reference to grain, but with it harvesting the land, um, this is important. And then there is this another angel who says, "Take." The angel takes his sickle and harvests the earth's vines, or the vine for the grapes. And so there's this image of harvest as judgment. And this accords well with the Gospels. Jesus tells the stories, parables of harvest as judgment. And so we see this particularly in the parable of the wheat and the weeds, where Jesus says the kingdom of God, as Jesus reigns, it is like a farmer that goes out and sows grain, sows the seed in the ground. And then at night, another person comes, an enemy, and sows weeds in the same place. And by the time that the seeds come up and there's a recognition that there is a difference between the wheat and the weeds, the farmer's servants say, should we pull up the weeds? And he says, no, if you do that, you're going to harm the wheat and it's not time for harvest. And so there's this sense in which there is a time for harvest at the end, and then the wheat will be thrown away into the fire to be burned. The grain, the good grain, stays. There's other parables of harvest as judgment. And so this is good. The other thing that I want to point out about Jesus's parables is that he basically makes this statement that a tree is known by its fruit. So you know what kind of tree it is by fruit. So we know that an apple tree is an apple tree because it has apples on it. And in Jesus' statements is to say we know that we're following him, we're true followers because we have the Spirit of Christ and because our lives bear the fruit of the Spirit. And so, again, this is the condemnation, the woes against the Pharisees because they try and do this outward appearance, and yet inside their internal lives do not match the outside. He says, you're whitewashed tombs. The outside looks good, but inside is death. And so there's this sense in which at the harvest, what is true is made known. And so, again, there's this sense in which I point that out because this will make sense in a little bit, but there's this judgment on what is truth, what is real. And again, these two groups, those that follow the Lamb, that are with him in heavenly worship, are the ones that are singing the song of the Lamb, the new song before the throne. They accept right worship, right love. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They respond to the love of God in obedience and sing his song. But those that are destined for hell are those that reject the love and they give in to the worship of the beast and its image. They go along with their depraved minds, their wickedness. They don't receive the love and the forgiveness that the cross offers. And so they also reject worship. They are worshiping a false god, the beast. And so this is the picture of judgment of harvest, as seeing what is true. But this is the thing about this harvest that is interesting to me. So we see here, as I said, a picture of a harvest of the grain and of the grapes. And most commentators would say that this is the good and the bad. So the grapes are, because they're used for wrath, they would be the evil. But I think this is really hard for me because what what comes to your mind when we talk about grain and grapes? Maybe I could put it in this term: bread and wine. It seems to recall communion, maybe. And the cross as being the body of Christ and the blood of Christ poured out for us. And so there's a lot going on here that I think that we miss in just saying this is a final judgment scene. I think there is something here in regards to the worship. Um, Last week I had mentioned the top of the stained glass in the church having a symbol. It's got an E with a big C around it. Um, and then it's got 7 torches and then a ribbon that has some writing. And I couldn't read the writing, and so this past week I got my binoculars and I still couldn't read the writing, and so I had to get a ladder. And I stood up and I got the ladder. And the writing said, "For Chris and the church." And so we could take that and read it literally, but I think what it probably means, we have to kind of use our investigative skills, is that there was probably a T at one time. And so it probably means for Christ and the church. And but this is the thing is I was really surprised last week when I asked, does anybody know what this means? Nobody knew what it meant. And so this symbol, which would have been the person who put this stained glass in, would have known exactly what it meant, and the people in the church, when this was put in, probably knew what the symbol meant, and yet the meaning of it has not been passed on. And I think that this is the case a lot with Revelation, where we see these symbols and we have not heard what the church has said over the years as to what these things might mean. We weren't there in the first churches that received this letter, the 7 churches. And so I think that it would have meant something particular to them. And so my guess, again, is to say that the same reality, we'll talk about this again next week, but the same reality of the love of God is both received, can either be received as love or it can be received as wrath. Because those that don't want it, intimacy with God, the presence of God, is the worst thing in the world. And so I think that this is what John is trying to get after, is what you're doing in worship matters. What's also interesting about this passage and why I think it might point to the cross as the place of judgment is it says that these grapes were gathered, thrown into the great winepress of God's wrath, but it says they were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and the blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia. So 1,600 stadia is a distance of 180 miles. So I'm pretty sure that the width of Indiana, as I've driven the width on various highways, Interstate 70, Interstate 74, the width of Indiana is about 180 miles. So if you can put that in your head a little bit. But it's also, that number is what's estimated to be the top and bottom distance of the land of Israel. So the promised land, top to bottom, about 180 miles. And so this I think is a reference to blood being shed in atonement for the land. It covers the land. And this is really interesting to me because this other place in the New Testament, having this same phrase that outside the city something was done, is in Hebrews 13, and it's talking of Christ. And it says, Hebrews 13 is again comparing the worship of the old covenant and the new. And it says this in verse 9, "Do not be carried away by all kinds of strange teachings. It is good for our hearts to be strengthened by grace, not by eating ceremonial foods which have no benefit to those who do so. So he says, we have an altar which those who minister at the tabernacle have no right to eat. So he's talking about the old covenant. You would take your sacrifice to the temple or to the tabernacle before there was a temple, and the sacrifice would be the animal would be slain, the blood would be poured out, and then a portion of it would be eaten by those that had brought the sacrifice. We see this throughout. And so those sacrificial meals, the ceremonial foods, have no benefit from that altar. But he's saying we have an altar from which those who minister at the tabernacle have no right to eat at. And why? Because the high priest carries the blood of the animals into the most holy place as a sin offering, but the bodies are burned outside of the camp. And so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood. It's his blood that was shed outside the camp that atones for sins, that brings unity, that allows us into the heavenly temple. So he says, let us then go to him, Jesus, outside the camp, bearing the disgrace he bore. For we do not have an enduring city, but we are looking for the city that is to come, the heavenly Jerusalem, not the earthly Jerusalem. And so through Jesus, because of his blood, we therefore let us continually offer to God a sacrifice, both of praise from our lips and sharing with others, doing good, sharing others. This is also these are also sacrifices that please God. And so again, there's this phrase that it's outside of the camp that Jesus is slain, and that's where his blood is poured out. He is the high priest and the victim. He is the sacrifice. He is the altar. He is all of those things. So the blood is poured out in the heavenly temple, and it allows us to go in with confidence, as Hebrews 4 says. And so in the same way, it's interesting to see these same pictures in the book of Revelation 14. Even though there's this judgment, it seems like this might be pointing to the cross and then the worship that comes out of that, the bread and the wine. And but again, these are symbols that I think we have to wrestle with. We're not quite sure what they mean. So the last thing I want to talk about today is just answering this question: why am I going through Revelation? So just as John, I think, had a why as to why he wrote. Yes, it's from Jesus. These visions are from Jesus. But he's on the island of Patmos as a pastor of these 7 churches, and he's sending a letter to them because he cares for them. And so he has reasons for why he's encouraging them through this difficult time of persecution that he's sharing in. And one of those things is to persevere. And I think for me, this is one of the reasons why I think I was drawn to Revelation. I mean, I feel like God asked me to preach through it. And as I've kind of shared with some, most Sundays, most weeks, I question, okay, God, why did you have me do this? Did I get things wrong? This is really difficult. But I think big picture wise, it's really important for me to share this reality of a need to persevere in our faith. As church attendance is dwindling in our country, even in our own church, as the faithful witness to Christ becomes more and more rejected in this world around us, in Edinburgh, in Illinois, in the nation. Um, there is a need to remain faithful. There is a call to perseverance, and so this comes over and over again in the book of Revelation. And so this is on my heart to share the desire to be faithful, to persevere to the end, to conquer. And then secondly, I think it gives especially a picture of heaven that I think that we desperately need. If we're going to persevere to the end, we have to know what the end for us has. And what we see is a picture of heaven that is not me by myself getting to do whatever I want, is like I'm at this cosmic um, amusement park. Um, but it is a picture of intimacy with God in worship, being right with God and right with others. There is a picture of heaven where everything is in its order, everything turns out okay. Um, but it is this picture of this fulfillment of what our hearts long for, that we are known intimately by God, that we are loved, that we are affirmed, and that we share in peace with all those around us. And all of creation responds in praise. And this is the right order of things that we struggle with on this earth. And so that's really, I think, another reason why I've been enjoying these visions of heaven that I think we need in our brains, in our hearts. And then, as we have talked about the last couple of weeks, the reality of hell. This is something that is really hard to talk about these days. And so, having this picture of the reality of heaven and hell, I think, is really important. So, I want to end again with this call to perseverance. This call to be full of faith, to trust Jesus, that he is the Lamb, that he knows what he's doing, and that as we cling to him, as we cling to the cross, right, as we cling to the bread and the wine, that we will conquer. And so this saying, and in this conquering, we will be at rest. Write this, says the voice from heaven. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit. They will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them. What we do in this life truly does echo for eternity. Will we trust? Will we have faith and obey out of that faith? Or will we reject the love of God? This is what's before us. So God bless you guys, and go in peace this week.